50 Shades of Grey isn't just a bad novel. It's the exact reason my homeowners association tried to bankrupt me. They slapped a $10,000 fine on my house over a microscopic difference in my roof shingles. They threatened foreclosure. They just forgot one tiny detail. I owned their building. Hail sounds a lot like handfuls of gravel being violently thrown against your siding. Spring in the Midwest doesn't arrive with chirping birds and blooming flowers. It ambushes you. My father had been in the ground for exactly 42 days when the storm hit. I was sitting at my kitchen table, staring blankly at a sprawling, disorganized stack of probate forms, when the ceiling directly above the refrigerator started weeping. First, it was a slow, rhythmic drip. Then a dark, bruised-looking water stain blossomed across the white drywall, spreading outward like spilled ink. Within 20 minutes, the drip turned into a steady, pathetic stream. I didn't panic. I didn't even yell. When you are drowning in the administrative nightmare of recent death, the phone calls to banks, the cancellation of utility bills, the endless loops of automated customer service lines, a leaking roof just feels like a punchline to a joke you're already tired of hearing. I grabbed an orange Home Depot bucket from the garage, shoved it under the leak, and listened to the hollow thwack, whack, thwack of the water hitting the plastic. I lived in Whispering Pines. The name itself was a lie. There were no pines and nothing whispered. It was a manicured, rigidly controlled suburban development built in the late 90s, where every house was a slight variation of 3 beige floor plans. I bought the place 5 years ago, when I thought I was going to get married. The engagement imploded, but I kept the house. It was too big for one guy, but it was quiet. Or at least, it was supposed to be. The next morning the sun came out, mocking the destruction. I walked out to my driveway. The ground was littered with torn, grit-covered asphalt shingles. My roof looked like it had been chewed on by a giant dog. I called Tom. Tom was an old high school buddy who ran a local roofing and exterior business. He was the kind of guy who permanently smelled like cheap coffee and roofing tar, and he possessed a beautifully abrasive, no-nonsense outlook on life. He showed up 2 hours later, scrambled up a ladder, and came down shaking his head. "It's trashed, Dean," Tom said, wiping a streak of dirt from his forehead. Wind lifted the flashing. Hail battered the composite. "You're down to the raw wood in 3 spots. One more rainstorm, and your kitchen becomes a swimming pool." "Just fix it," I said, rubbing the back of my neck. "How fast?" Tom pulled a crushed pack of cigarettes from his flannel pocket, thought better of it, and shoved it back. "Here's the problem. The supply chains are still a complete mess. Your current roof is Owens Corning slate gray. I called my supplier. I can't get slate gray for 6 weeks, maybe 8, but," he pointed a calloused finger at me, "I have 4 pallets of charcoal gray sitting in my warehouse right now. Someone canceled an order." "What is the difference?" I asked. Tom laughed, a short, barking sound. "To a normal human being, nothing. To a spectrograph, charcoal is maybe 2% darker. From the curb, God himself couldn't tell the difference unless he was holding the shingles side by side under a halogen lamp." "Do the charcoal," I said. I just wanted to sleep through the night without listening to water destroy my drywall. I didn't care about the HOA. I didn't care about architectural review boards. I was 38 years old, newly orphaned, and utterly exhausted. The crew arrived the next morning. For 2 days, my house was a chaotic symphony of nail guns, tearing paper, and heavy boots stomping overhead. When they finished, the roof looked fantastic. Dark, clean, and most importantly, watertight. I wrote Tom a check, shook his hand, and went back inside to deal with my father's estate. 3 days later, I found the yellow slip of paper taped to my front door. It wasn't neatly placed in the mailbox. It was aggressively taped to the glass at eye level, using thick packing tape that left a sticky residue. I peeled it off and read the bold, black lettering at the top. Notice of covenant violation. It was signed by Diane. Diane was the president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. She was a woman in her late 60s who treated her unpaid, elected position with the gravitas of a four-star general defending the homeland. She drove a pristine silver Lexus, wore pastel tracksuits, and wielded her metal clipboard like a weapon. The notice was entirely devoid of human empathy. It cited Article 4, Section 2B of the Community Guidelines. Any and all structural modifications, including but not limited to roof replacements, must strictly adhere to the approved community color palette and require prior written authorization from the Architectural Review Committee. Underneath, in sharp, angry red ink, Diane had written, "Unapproved material, non-compliant color installed. Remove and replace immediately." I stared at the paper. I looked up at the roof. It was gray. My house was gray. The neighbor's roof was gray. I crumpled the notice into a tight ball, threw it in the kitchen trash can, and went back to sorting my dead father's medical bills. It was a fraction of a shade. I assumed they would realize how insane they were being and drop it. That was my first mistake. You cannot use logic on people who treat petty authority as a substitute for a personality. Grief does something strange to your perception of time. Days stretch out into endless, hollow marathons, yet weeks completely disappear. A month passed. During that time, I was locked in a brutal bureaucratic wrestling match with the probate court, trying to unfreeze my father's assets. My dad, Richard, was a tough, quiet man who made his living buying up cheap commercial real estate in the 90s. He was deeply pragmatic, notoriously private, and kept his business strictly to himself. Now, I was left to untangle a web of LLCs, tax documents, and bank accounts. While I was drowning in paperwork, Diane was mounting an offensive. The first yellow slip on the door was just a warning shot. 2 weeks later, a certified letter arrived. I had to sign for it at the post office. It informed me that my willful negligence had resulted in a fine of $100. 7 days after that, another certified letter. The fine had jumped to $500. The letter stated that the roof was a blight on the neighborhood aesthetic and a direct threat to surrounding property values. It demanded that I submit a timeline for the complete removal of the illegal roofing material. I tried calling the HOA management number. It went to a voicemail box that sounded like it had been recorded in a wind tunnel. I left 3 messages explaining about my dad, the leak, the storm, and the supply chain. No one called back. When the third letter arrived, threatening a $10,000 special assessment fine and a potential lien against my property, the exhaustion finally gave way to a cold, vibrating anger. I looked at the bottom of the letter. The HOA board met on the first Tuesday of every month. I was going. The meeting was held at the HOA's headquarters, located in a depressing, low-slung commercial strip mall on the absolute edge of the county line. We pulled into the parking lot. Half the asphalt was cracked, with weeds sprouting through the fissures. The HOA office was sandwiched between a failing dry cleaner that constantly smelled of perchloroethylene and a sad, dark storefront that used to be a vape shop. I pushed open the glass door of Suite B. The interior was aggressively bleak, water-stained drop ceilings, flickering fluorescent tube lights that buzzed like angry hornets, and cheap commercial carpet that looked like it had been glued down in 1998. At the far end of the room, behind a series of folding tables arranged end-to-end to form a pathetic imitation of a judge's bench, sat the board. Diane was in the center, flanked by Greg, a man who looked like he had peaked in middle management and sweated entirely too much, and a woman who was intensely knitting. About 15 residents sat in squeaky metal folding chairs, waiting to be scolded. I took a seat in the back. For an hour, I watched Diane systematically dismantle her neighbors. She fined a woman for leaving her trash cans out 3 hours past the deadline. She berated a man whose grass was officially measured at 4 inches instead of the mandated 3.5. She didn't just enforce rules, she savored the enforcement. Her eyes lit up with a terrifying hollow joy every time she brought down her little wooden gavel. Finally, she called my name. "Dean, property lot 44, architectural violation." I stood up and walked to the single plastic chair positioned in front of their folding tables. It felt like a bad police interrogation. "Dean," Diane said, looking over her glasses, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "We are very disappointed. You replaced a roof without submitting Form ARC7, and you utilized an unauthorized color. Your roof is charcoal. Our community standard is slate." "Diane," I said, trying to keep my voice level, fighting the tremor in my chest. "They are essentially the identical color. I had water actively pouring into my kitchen. My contractor couldn't get slate for 2 months. I did what I had to do to protect my home. More importantly, my father passed away right before the storm. I have been out of my mind trying to handle his estate. I'm just asking for a little bit of grace here." The room went dead silent. The woman stopped knitting. Greg looked down at his legal pad, uncomfortable. I thought for a brief second that I had reached them. I thought the universal language of grief might penetrate the bureaucracy. Diane clicked her pen. "We are all very sorry for your loss, Dean," she said flatly, with all the emotional warmth of an automated teller machine. "However, personal tragedies do not exempt us from our contractual obligations to this community. If we allow you to bypass the color guidelines because you are having a hard month, where does it end? Next week someone paints their house neon green. Rules are what separate us from animals, Dean." "Animals?" I repeated, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. "It's the same shade of gray, Diane. You can't even tell the difference." "The board can tell," she countered, leaning forward. "And the board has voted. Your violation stands. You have 30 days to replace the roof with the approved slate shingles, or the $10,000 penalty will be finalized. If you fail to pay, we will place a lien on your property. We can, and will, foreclose to protect the integrity of Whispering Pines." She hit the gavel, smack. "Next item on the agenda," she announced, looking right through me. I didn't yell. I didn't flip the table. I just stood up, the blood roaring in my ears, and walked out into the humid night air. I felt completely, utterly powerless. They had the legal right. I had signed the CCRs when I bought the house. They could actually take my home over a fraction of a color pigment, and there was absolutely nothing I could do about it. At least, that's what I thought. I barely slept that night. The threat of a $10,000 fine was crippling. My bank accounts were low. Everything my father owned was currently frozen in the suffocating grip of probate. If the HOA levied the fine and I couldn't pay it, the late fees would compound. Then, the lawyer fees would attach. A $10,000 fine could snowball into a $30,000 debt in a matter of months. I would be forced to sell the house just to pay off Diane's ego. By 3 a.m., I was sitting at the dining room table, a cold cup of coffee in my hand, illuminated only by the harsh, yellow glow of the overhead chandelier. The table was divided into 2 distinct zones. On the left, the aggressive, red-inked demands from the Whispering Pines, HOA. On the right, 4 heavy cardboard banker's boxes filled with my father's business records. My dad, Richard, was not a man who talked about his feelings, but he was a man who understood leverage. He started with nothing, bought a failing laundromat in the AUS, flipped it, and spent the next 3 decades quietly acquiring strip malls, light industrial warehouses, and ugly commercial properties that no one else wanted. He operated through a dozen vaguely named LLCs, Apex Holdings, Blue River Properties, Ironwood Management. I pulled a heavy dust-covered ledger from the second box. I needed to see if there was any liquid cash in any of his operating accounts that the lawyer had missed, something I could use to pay off the roof before Diane stole my house. I spent hours scanning balance sheets, tax returns, and property deeds. It was mind-numbing work. My eyes were burning, blurring the numbers together. Around 5 a.m., I opened a manila folder labeled Ironwood Management, Tenant Leases. I flipped through the pages mechanically. A dry cleaner, a chiropractic clinic, a martial arts studio. Then my finger stopped on a piece of paper. I blinked hard. I leaned in, bringing the page closer to my face. The text was standard legal boilerplate, but the address at the top of the lease agreement sent a physical shockwave down my spine. 4420 West Elm Street, Suite B. I knew that address. The numbers felt heavy in my brain. I reached over to the left side of the table, grabbed the most recent certified threat from the HOA, and looked at the official letterhead printed neatly in the top right corner. Whispering Pines Homeowners Association 4420 West Elm Street, Suite B. The breath left my lungs in a sharp rush. I sat back in the chair, the silence of the house suddenly ringing in my ears. No, it couldn't be. The universe doesn't hand out coincidences like that. I grabbed my laptop, typed the address into Google Maps, and switched to Street View. The screen loaded. There it was, the cracked parking lot, the failing dry cleaner on the left, the dark storefront on the right, and right in the middle, the glass door with the Whispering Pines HOA logo stickered onto the window. My dad owned the strip mall. The LLC was now legally under my name as the sole executor and heir, which meant effectively I owned the strip mall. I owned the stained carpet Diane sat on. I owned the walls she hung her community maps on. I owned the roof over her head. A slow, dangerous smile crept across my face. The crushing weight in my chest evaporated, replaced by a sudden, electric surge of adrenaline. I pulled the lease agreement completely out of the folder and laid it flat on the table, smoothing the edges. I needed to know exactly what the terms were. I needed to know how much power I actually held. I read through the document line by line. The HOA had signed a 10-year commercial lease back in 2016. Because my dad hated dealing with turnover, he gave them a severely discounted rate, well below market value, in exchange for a decade-long commitment. They were paying absolute pennies for the space, but it wasn't 2016 anymore. I looked at the expiration date on the contract, March 31st. It was currently late May. The lease had expired almost 2 months ago. I scrambled to find the addendums. My dad was notoriously strict with his paperwork. I flipped to page 12, scanning the dense paragraphs until I found the section titled Holdover Tenancy. In the event the tenant remains in possession of the premises after the expiration of the term without the execution of a new lease, tenant shall be deemed to be occupying the premises as a month-to-month holdover tenant. Landlord reserves the right to terminate said holdover tenancy with 30 days written notice. Furthermore, during any holdover period, landlord reserves the right to adjust base rent to current market rates at landlord's sole discretion. They didn't have a long-term lease. They were sitting in my building month to month, completely exposed. They were completely reliant on the apathy of a landlord they thought was a faceless corporation called Ironwood Management. They had no idea Richard had passed away. They had no idea Ironwood Management was currently sitting at a dining room table in Lot 44, staring at a $10,000 fine for a charcoal gray roof. Diane wanted to talk about rules. She wanted to talk about contractual obligations. She loved the fine print when it allowed her to crush her neighbors. It was time to see how much she loved the fine print when it was aimed right between her eyes. I closed the folder, stood up, and walked to the kitchen. I poured my cold coffee down the sink. The sun was just starting to peek over the horizon, casting a pale, charcoal gray light over the neighborhood. I had 30 days to replace my roof, but I only needed 24 hours to draft an eviction notice. The law offices of David Hirsch smelled intensely of lemon pledge and old paper. David was my father's estate attorney. He was a man in his late 50s who wore suspenders without a trace of irony and possessed a profoundly cynical understanding of property law. He had spent the last 20 years helping my dad navigate the quiet, unglamorous world of light commercial real estate. I sat across from him in a leather chair that wheezed when I shifted my weight. I slid the Ironwood Management lease agreement across his heavy mahogany desk. David adjusted his reading glasses, sliding them down the bridge of his nose. He read in complete silence for 3 minutes. The only sound in the room was the heavy ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Finally, he looked up, a slow, predatory smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. "They are in holdover," David stated, tapping a gold pen against the contract. Your dad let the renewal lapse because his health was failing, and they never brought it up because they knew they were paying dirt. $850 a month for 1,200 square feet of commercial space in this county. It's a robbery. What's the market rate right now? I asked. For that specific footprint, given the parking availability and the zoning. David typed a few keys on his computer. 3,200. Minimum. And that's before triple net. With property taxes and maintenance fees factored in, a new tenant would be cutting you a check for roughly $3,800 a month. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. Can I raise their rent to $3,800? Dean, they are a commercial holdover tenant, David said, his voice dropping into a register of absolute professional certainty. Wait, commercial leases are not residential leases. There are no tear-jerking tenant protection laws here. They are a business entity operating without a net. You are the landlord. You can raise the rent to $10,000 a month tomorrow if you want to. If they don't pay it, you lock the doors, seize their folding tables, and put their community maps in a dumpster. I felt a hard, tight knot in my chest loosen for the first time since my dad's funeral. I don't want $10,000, I said. I want the exact market rate, but I also want to enforce every single clause in that lease that they are currently violating. I want them to feel what it's like to live under a microscope. David's smirk turned into a genuine smile. He flipped to the back of the lease. Well, let's take a look. Section 9. Maintenance of premises. Tenant shall maintain the interior of the property in a pristine, Grade A commercial standard. I've seen that office, Dean. The carpet is a biohazard. There are water stains on the acoustic ceiling tiles. Section 14. Signage. No unapproved window decals or permanent exterior modifications. They have that massive, peeling HOA logo plastered on the front glass. Write it up, I said. David drafted the documents that afternoon. We didn't send a polite email. We didn't leave a voicemail. When you are dealing with people who wield bureaucracy like a weapon, you have to respond with overwhelming, undeniable paperwork. We drafted a notice of rent increase and lease violation. It formally informed the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association that Ironwood Management was adjusting their holdover rent to $3,800 a month, effective in 30 days. It also included a detailed bulleted addendum listing 6 distinct lease violations, including the stained carpets, the unapproved window signage, and the improper storage of community landscaping equipment in the rear electrical closet. It gave them 14 days to remedy the aesthetic blights or face immediate eviction proceedings. I didn't mail it. I wanted this done right. I hired a private process server. His name was Mike. He was a retired cop who drove a battered Ford Taurus and looked like he ate gravel for breakfast. I paid him $200 for expedited service. At 10 a.m. the next morning, I was sitting in my truck across the street from the strip mall, parked in the lot of a competing grocery store. I watched Mike pull up to the HOA office. He got out, holding a thick manila envelope, and pushed open the glass door. I couldn't hear what was happening inside, but I could picture it perfectly. Diane sitting behind her folding table, probably measuring a neighbor's paint swatches. Mike asking for the authorized representative, Mike dropping the legal bomb right onto her clipboard. 2 minutes later, Mike walked back out, got into his Taurus, and drove away. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Mike. Served. The lady in the tracksuit looked like she swallowed a lemon. I put my truck in drive and headed home to my charcoal gray roof. For the first time in months, I slept through the entire night. Bureaucracies move slowly until their own survival is threatened. Then, they move with the frantic, uncoordinated energy of a kicked anthill. 3 days after the notice was served, I drove over to my dad's old house. It was empty now, smelling faintly of old coffee and cedar. I went into his home office and checked the voicemail on the dedicated landline he used for Ironwood Management. The red light on the answering machine was blinking furiously. I pressed play. First message. Thursday, 11:14 a.m. Yes, hello. This is Diane, president of the Whispering Pines HOA. We are a tenant at your West Elm property. I am calling regarding a highly irregular letter we received today. There must be a clerical error. Please call me back immediately at this number. Her voice was tight. The artificial sweetness she used during board meetings was completely gone. Second message, Friday, 9 a.m. Hello, Diane again. I am trying to reach someone at Ironwood Management. We have been loyal tenants for 10 years. A rent increase of this magnitude is entirely unacceptable and, frankly, predatory. We need to speak with ownership today. Third message, Monday, 4:30 p.m. Please, someone pick up the phone. This is Greg. I'm the treasurer for the HOA. Look, we don't have the budget for a $4,000 monthly rent. We operate on fixed community dues. If we have to pay this, we bankrupt our reserve fund in 3 months. We need to negotiate a realistic extension. Please call us back. I leaned back in my dad's heavy leather desk chair and listened to them beg. They were trapped, and they knew it. The HOA collected about $400 a year from the 300 houses in the neighborhood. That was roughly $120,000 annually. That money was strictly allocated for snow removal, common area landscaping, neighborhood insurance, and their previously cheap rent. If their rent suddenly jumped by $35,000 a year, the math simply broke. They would have to issue an emergency special assessment to the entire neighborhood just to cover the cost of their own office. If Diane tried to force every homeowner in Whispering Pines to pay an extra $300 a year just so she could keep sitting behind her folding table, there would be a riot. The residents would vote to dissolve the board entirely. Her power wasn't just threatened, it was functionally over. I didn't call them back. Silence is the most terrifying response you can give to someone who thrives on control. I let them sweat. I let the days tick down. Meanwhile, my own deadline was approaching. I had exactly 5 days left to replace my brand new charcoal roof with a slate one, or the $10,000 fine would be formalized and the lien process would begin. The final board meeting of the month was scheduled for Tuesday night. I spent Tuesday afternoon cleaning my dad's ledger. I put the Ironwood Management lease agreement, the corporate formation documents proving I was the sole managing member, and the uncashed $100 fine checks I had received from the HOA into a crisp black leather portfolio. It's 6:45 p.m. I pulled into the cracked parking lot of the West Elm Strip Mall. The atmosphere inside Suite B had drastically changed since my last visit. The air was thick with tension. The fluorescent lights still buzzed, but the aggressive confidence of the board was entirely missing. Diane looked exhausted. Her signature tracksuit was rumpled. The metal clipboard was resting flat on the table, not being held like a shield. Greg looked like he hadn't slept in a week. He was furiously rubbing his temples, staring blankly at a spreadsheet printed on a piece of paper. The knitting woman wasn't knitting. The crowd of residents was smaller tonight. Maybe 10 people, mostly the regulars complaining about loose dogs or poorly parked cars. I sat in the very back row, crossing my arms, and waited. Diane rushed through the initial agenda items. She wasn't savoring the punishments anymore. She dismissed a trash can violation with a wave of her hand. She approved a fence installation without even looking at the property survey. She just wanted the meeting to end. She was a woman staring down the barrel of a financial cannon, and the petty squabbles of the neighborhood suddenly felt incredibly insignificant. Finally, as she looked down at the last item on the paper, she swallowed hard. "Property lot 44, she announced. Her voice lacked its usual bite. Dean. I stood up slowly, picking up my black leather portfolio. I walked down the center aisle of squeaky folding chairs and stood directly in front of their tables. "Dean," Diane said, lacing her fingers together. "Tomorrow is the 30-day deadline regarding your unauthorized roof replacement. The board has not received an updated ARC form, nor have we seen contractors out there removing the charcoal shingles. Have you scheduled the replacement?" "No," I said calmly. "I haven't." Greg sighed, a heavy, defeated sound. Diane narrowed her eyes, a brief flash of her old arrogance returning. "Then the $10,000 penalty will automatically apply at midnight tomorrow," she stated, grabbing a red pen. "We will be forced to place a lien on the property. You leave us no choice. The rules are clear. Before you sign that, I said, my voice steady, carrying clearly across the quiet room, I have a question about the integrity of this neighborhood. Diane stopped. Excuse me? A month ago you told me that rules are what separate us from animals, I said, quoting her exact words back to her. You said that contractual obligations must be strictly enforced, regardless of personal circumstances. You said that ignoring the fine print leads to the decay of property values. It does, Diane snapped, which is why your roof— I completely agree with you now, Diane, I interrupted. I unzipped the black portfolio. In fact, I've taken your advice to heart. Contracts are sacred, which is why I'm extremely concerned about the financial mismanagement of this board. Greg sat up straight. What are you talking about? I pulled out a copy of the notice of rent increase and lease violation and dropped it directly onto Diane's clipboard. I'm talking about the fact that this association is operating on an expired commercial lease, I said loudly, making sure the 10 residents behind me could hear every word. I'm talking about the fact that you are currently facing a nearly 400% rent increase that you cannot afford. And I'm talking about the fact that you are in direct violation of Section 9 and Section 14 of your lease agreement by allowing this office to look like a decaying bus station. The silence in the room was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet. The buzzing of the fluorescent lights suddenly sounded deafening. Diane stared at the piece of paper on her clipboard, her face drained of all color. It went from a pale pink to a sickening, chalky white. She looked at the document, then looked up at me, her eyes wide with a sudden, dawning terror. How? She whispered, her voice cracking. How do you have this? I looked at her. I looked at Greg, whose jaw was practically touching the floor. Because Ironwood Management was my father's company, I said. He died. He left it to me. I am the sole owner and managing member of the LLC. You are sitting in my building, Diane. You are breathing my air, and as of right now, you have exactly 14 days to fix those water stains and scrape that ridiculous sticker off my front window, or I am locking the doors and throwing your metal folding chairs into the street. If you have never seen a tyrant realize they have absolutely no armor, I highly recommend it. It is a profoundly quiet, spectacular collapse. Diane literally shrunk in her seat. The rigid posture she had maintained for years evaporated. She looked down at her hands, then back at the notice, her brain struggling to reconcile the fact that the man she was trying to bankrupt was the man who owned the ground she was sitting on. Behind me, one of the residents let out a low, slow whistle. Greg was the first to break. He was an accountant by trade, and accountants understand survival. He practically shoved his chair back and leaned over the table. "Oh, Dean!" Greg stammered, raising both hands in a gesture of surrender. Listen to me, please. We had no idea. We've been trying to reach your office all week. We can't pay $3,800 a month. It breaks the budget. It destroys the association. Rules are rules, Greg, I said, mirroring their cold, bureaucratic tone perfectly. You signed a contract. A holdover tenancy allows for market adjustments. Ignorance of the law does not exempt you from its consequences. Isn't that what you guys print at the bottom of all your violation letters? Diane finally found her voice. It was thin and reedy. You're doing this because of the roof. This is retaliation. No, Diane, I corrected her, resting my hands on the edge of the folding table. Retaliation would be me locking the doors tonight and tying you up in civil court for a year. This is just business. My father gave you a sweetheart deal for a decade. He's gone now. The charity's over. Your failure to secure a long-term lease is a breach of fiduciary duty to the homeowners of Whispering Pines. I turned slightly, looking back at the 10 residents in the audience. They were staring at Diane with a mix of shock and rising anger. Did you guys know, I addressed the room, that your HOA president let the lease on this office expire, and that she's looking at a $30,000 deficit that you are going to have to pay for through special assessments? The murmurs started immediately. An older man in the second row stood up. Diane, is that true? Are you going to assess us because you forgot to renew a piece of paper? We are managing it, Diane yelled, though it sounded more like a plea. She looked back at me, her eyes wet with angry, humiliated tears. What do you want, Dean? What is it going to take? I turned back to the board. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just wanted my peace. Here is what is going to happen, I said, keeping my voice low and hard. First, you are going to open that binder and pull out the notice of violation for property lot 44. You are going to formally approve the charcoal gray roof installation, retroactive to the date of completion. You are going to waive the $10,000 fine, and you are going to waive all previous late fees. Diane's hand trembled as she reached for her red pen. And the rent? If you approve my roof, I continued, Ironwood Management will grant the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association a 90-day lease extension at your current rate of $850 a month. That gives you exactly 3 months to pack up your clipboards, find a new commercial space, and get out of my building. Because after 90 days, the rent goes to $4,000, and I will evict you the next morning. Greg didn't even wait for Diane. He grabbed the official minute book, flipped to the back, and started furiously scribbling. The board motions to retroactively approve the roofing material at Lot 44 due to emergency weather conditions and supply chain limitations, Greg said loudly, his voice shaking. All fines waived. Do I have a second? He looked at the knitting woman. Second, she whispered quickly. All in favor? Greg asked. Aye, Greg and the woman said simultaneously. They both turned to Diane. She was staring at her metal clipboard. The weapon she had used to terrorize her neighbors for a decade was completely useless. She slowly raised her head, looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated defeat, and nodded. Aye, she croaked. Greg stamped the paper, signed it, and slid it across the folding table to me. I picked it up. It was an official variance, signed, sealed, and legally binding. My house was safe. My bank account was safe. You have 90 days, Diane, I said, sliding the variance into my portfolio. And clean the carpets before you leave, or I'm keeping your security deposit. I zipped the portfolio shut, turned around, and walked down the center aisle. The residents actually parted for me. As I pushed open the glass door and stepped out into the warm, humid night air, I looked up at the faded, peeling Whispering Pines logo on the window. I felt a strange, profound sense of calm wash over me. My dad was a quiet man. He never knew how to talk to me about my life, my failed engagement, or my problems. We mostly sat in silence, watching baseball or fixing carburetors. But standing there in that cracked parking lot, holding the paperwork that saved my home, I finally understood how he communicated his love. He didn't say it, he built it. He bought ugly buildings and negotiated airtight leases so that one day, when a storm hit and the roof started leaking, I would have exactly what I needed to survive the weather. I got into my truck, turned the key, and drove home. The next morning it rained, a heavy, driving Midwest downpour. I sat at my kitchen table, drinking a hot cup of coffee, and listened to the rain hit my unapproved, illegal, perfectly watertight charcoal gray roof. It was the best sound in the world. And that is how reading the fine print of my late father's estate allowed me to legally evict the very HOA trying to steal my house. Sometimes the universe hands you the perfect checkmate. If you enjoyed watching Diane's little neighborhood dictatorship crumble as much as I enjoyed dismantling it, please drop a like, hit that subscribe button, and share this video with anyone who hates their HOA. Let me know your worst HOA horror stories in the comments below.